Okay, let's explore module tracing in a little more details. Okay, we are imagining that we have an application written using some PL/SQL code, and this is a procedure called add employees that does some work inserting an employee. So in this case, they limited the scope to one insert statement. But what we want to do is instrument this with a module and an action name. To do that, within their block for the add employees procedure, we're going to make a call to dbms underscore application info, call set module as a procedure, and then give it the parameters. We give it a module name. This one naturally will be called add employees because that's the PL/SQL code it's a part of. And then they're going to put an action name in it. Now this module only has one insert into it. In some, they might be a whole transaction. I might bound it by a transaction. It's really up to you. You can decide what makes the most sense. But we're adding an action, which is really the statement we're doing, insert into an employees. And what that does is give me the ability to turn on tracing for just this one statement within the application if I choose. If I don't have the modules and actions set, then my only scope is service name, which is maybe much more I have to trace than I'd really like to get some information about this insert. But this will give us a nice information. Then when we're done, we can set either the action name till null by giving the second parameter as null, and it will close the action. If we wanted to have multiple actions within the same module, then we could open another action, or we can close both of them in this case because they only wanted to have the one insert within the action, and that will close the action. We have to explicitly call the set module with a null for one or both of them to either one of them. The second one closes the action, both of them closes the action and the module. Okay. Then later on, when we're running the application, we can trace just this one SQL statement within this particular module by calling dbms monitor.server module action trace enable, and then mentioning the service name this runs out of, could be the HR service perhaps, and then the action, the module, which is add employee, and since there's only one thing in it, it will automatically do the insert. If I had created multiple actions within it, I could actually specify the particular action. Even here I could specify it, but since the action and the module are basically the same, I don't really need to do that in this case. Okay, this was an example. We wanted to call or add the following procedure code to set the name of the current action within the current module. The assumption is we've opened up a module name earlier on, somewhere along the way, and then we have this procedure balance transaction that's going to take some input. Our amount we're going to do as our transaction. Then we're just setting the action name. You can do set action instead of the module and the action. So call dbms action, set action, and the action name is going to transfer from checking to savings account. We're doing a bank transaction in this case. So to do that, they're actually doing two updates, okay, in this case. That makes up a logical transaction. And of course, we'd like both of them to occur or neither. Because if they're going to take $5 out of my checking account so I can buy lunch and put it in my savings account, perhaps my debit is off my savings account, I want them to do both, move it out of my checking and put it in my savings, or I don't want to do either. If they do one without the other, well, I may have just lost Trevor's $5, you know, that's the last $5 we have. I don't have enough to buy lunch. So we need both of these to occur. So we're going to put the set action at the end of the transaction, which is two statements and the commit statement, two updates and a commit in this case. And then we can turn on tracing for the service name, the module, and the action. Now in their little example below, we just say you fill in your service name and module, whatever application they're for. But we were just focusing on the action. So execute DBMS monitor out of line from where the application is running. Okay, server module action trace enabled. And we're doing it for our service name. Okay, could be financial system, okay, accounting system. Module is transfer funds, and the action is transfer from check to savings perhaps. And we want to turn it on for these. It would have to have a module and a service name to be able to do it, but we left them in as generic. Okay. Little example of tracing a client, we can call or add the following procedure in your code to set or clear the tracing for a particular client ID. Okay. So in our procedure, okay, we want to set or a session ID to some value. We don't even specify what it is, just a particular ID. Then have the application do something, so there would be more code in here, so I guess we should have put a couple of three dots to represent epsilon. We were missing some things. Then when we're done, we can clear the identifier. Then if we want to turn it on just for this particular client identifier, we can go in and the client identifier they pick, even though we didn't put it in physically in here, we're going to trace for a client identifier C4. We want the wait events, but we don't want the bind events in this case. Okay. Another example is turning on tracing for all the sessions in the database. Please don't do this on a production database. Maybe on a test if you want to do a shotgun effect. You can just call DBMS monitor, database trace enabled. And the first one says, do I want the bind information, the wait states, and the second one, do I want the bind information? They're setting both to true. Sometime later, hopefully not too long later, they turn it off. You can also do it for a particular session ID and a serial number by calling DBMS monitor session trace enable. Pass it in the session ID. The DBAs can look these up if you can't, and the session ID. And once again, we want the waits, but we didn't want the bind variable. We set the binds equals false. And then when we're finished running the portion of the application by that session, usually we get the session connected, get it ready to run it. DBAs goes, looks it up, and then they turn on tracing, get the user to run the application, and then turn off tracing for that session. And then we have the SQL during a portion of an application that was causing us a problem. We're concerned about the SQL. We want to see how it's performing. And we're only limiting the scope to one session, so it makes it easier to see if that reduplicates the problem, if the SQL leads us to a solution. You can also trace your own session by calling DBMS session trace enable, asking for the waits and or the binds. You pick the combinations of false and trues that make sense. And then you can turn it off later. Using this method, you don't need alter session to trace your own session, which is useful if you don't have too many elevated privileges on a particular database. And then this statement can be used in conjunction with the tracing of a session, particularly your own, but you usually put it before you turn on tracing. So just think of another option they should have turned on before. The trace files get a nice unique name, but they're really difficult to figure out which session they belong to. You can put something in there that the DBAs can figure out which ones you're referring to. Quite often I just put my first name on the databases I work on, but you can decide. Maybe the DBAs want to have a particular convention. Maybe your session ID you use to connect to the database or what makes sense to them. Next up is having a quick look at the trace session utility. It allows us to combine files from multiple servers that represent different portions of one logical service, one user connected running an application, okay, and then get them pulled together into one unified trace file so we can pass it to TKProf as the next step. So, trace session utility. And there are three basic ways we can consolidate trace files. One, you can do it by a session ID. Two, we can do it by a client ID. Or three, we can do it by a combination of service name, action, or module. You do session, or you do client, or you do a permissible combination of service action name. And that will go look through a group of trace files, bring the SQL that belongs to a particular session ID, or the SQL for a particular client ID, or a particular service, or service action module combination, and put it in one trace file. So in this case, if we're tracing the CRM service, we could do it as a service name. Okay, or we could trace one particular client by either session ID or client ID. Okay, now trace session is just a little command line utility to amalgamate the files. Once again, you may be able to do this as a developer, or maybe we need to have the DBAs do it, but at least you can provide the information so he can call it appropriately to get the output that you need to analyze. So they're going to call trace session. We give it the output file, okay, and then how we're going to limit it, either by the session ID or by client ID or by a combination of service, action, or module. And there's a group of allowable combinations. And then finally, we give it a group of input files. And you can use wildcards to specify this. You can look for all the files. The more you give it, if there's some way to limit it a little bit based on file name, it will make it a little faster to do. But if you can't, you could give it all the trace files in the trace destination. The DBA is going to use all the trace files in the trace destination. And what it will do is combine it together. So this is a little example of using it, okay? So in this example, you normally be using JDBC connection pooling, and it will be set up okay and just enable it for a particular user session. This was a way of using regular sessions using dedicated servers to emulate it, okay? So we're going to execute, and we're going to have three sessions. One of them is the yellowy session. One is the brown session, at least that's the way I see it. It looks pretty orangey brown to me on some terminal monitors, depends on which monitor I'm using some days. And then we have the green session. Two of them, the yellow and the brown, we're actually going to use to run SQL for the application, but we're simulating, we have connection pooling using two dedicated servers. And then the third one is used as the control session to control the tracing. We're not actually executing the application code in here. So what we want to do is do this by a session identifier. So we can call, after we log into the first session with the HR schema or the HR account on the database, we can call DBMS session set identifier HR session, okay, to get it tagged as part of the HR session, log in a second terminal window to the database, connect as a HR user, and execute the same command within it to tag it as a HR session. Now we have two dedicated servers, but we've tagged their output in the trace files so we can identify them as being related to the same logical session, the HR session. Very nice. Now we're going to use our third session, which needs some privileges to control it. So quite often this may be the DBA, maybe us if it's our database. And we want to do execute DBMS monitor client ID trace enable, and then pass in the client ID as HR session. Of course, it wrapped in a funner place. You don't want to wrap it on in the middle of a string, but hey, that's just a little editing detail. Okay, weights equals false, bind variables equals false. If you didn't want these, I believe those are the defaults. You shouldn't actually have to put them in, but they put them in just to say you can control it the way you want. Now we're turning on tracing for these two sessions logically. Okay, our first session and our second session. Now we do within the first one piece of the application. So a simple select, just to keep it simple, select star from employees. And then we do in the second session another piece of the application, select star from the departments. Okay. Then we execute DBMS monitor client ID trace disabled for our HR session. We no longer want to trace it. We should disconnect from session 1 and session 2 cleanly if we're doing this in SQL Plus, because we buffer up the trace files and we want these statements in the trace files. Thank you. Okay, and then we can go and grab the 2 individual trace files and merge the pieces of them together that represent the select statements for this application that happen to be run across 2 sessions. Okay, the way we said. Of course, there would be, in a real application, each of the sessions is running a lot more code, but if we did that, it wouldn't fit on our screen, so it would be inconvenient. So in this case, we're calling trace session. This is going to be our new trace file. That's a combination of the 2 trace files from these 2 sessions. We're going to pull the things together that represent the information for our client ID HR session, the way we tagged our 2 sessions. And then we need to look at it where they're stored, and we're just going to look across all the trace files out there. Grab all of them.